Excellent.
I can never be too sure, but I'm thinking this says, "Hey, Sabriya, how are you?"
I'm good. Hi, Dr. Keith. We're good.
Okay. So if anything, we are being recorded, so thumbs up on that. We are now live, based on what Zoom and YouTube are telling me. So recognize that this is my second Envision Speaker Series live stream event. So I did one in January. Mitch was a part of that. Before I continue, I just want to take care of some technical issues. I'm making everybody a co-host just in case my call drops. The three of you need to continue the conversation and I'll pick it up. And so
Absolutely.
this is what we'll do is we'll at least have an hour long conversation. It will be a panel discussion I will facilitate. This is about the topic of suicide. So under the umbrella of suicide, and we'll make the disclaimer now and probably throughout the conversation that if this is a touchy subject for anybody who's watching or listening and you are going to be triggered, stop watching, stop listening. And so this may have some emotional or psychological triggers. And my second disclaimer is this is not a conversation around mental illness. This is a conversation about wellness and wholeness. But I will add to the fact that I am a two-time suicide attempt survivor. Actually, three, but I never really count the one that was in graduate school, and that was a different time in my life. But as a mature adult male, in the past 11 years, that has been my life has imploded a couple of times. And the second time was rather serious. And the man with us, Mitch Gray, I always call him my angel, but I always give him a shout out because he invested his life into me. And so I'm paying it back and paying it forward. So, with that being as it is, let's go ahead and get started. So, welcome everybody to the call. Welcome everybody in the audience. My name is Dr. Keith McNally, and this is the Envision Speakers Series. And so today's conversation is around suicide. And specifically, we're going to start from a broad perspective and we're going to come down, 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 because our focus is going to be North Carolina and specifically Raleigh, North Carolina. And unfortunately, in 2023, NC State University has been in the news. And so our focus eventually will need to get to the collegiate population, or at the very least, those people in the 18 to 25, 26-year-old, because our younger generation is struggling and we need to figure out, we probably won't have all the answers today, but hopefully this year and beyond, we will come together as a community in different areas across the globe and of course globally to address the issue of suicide. So as I typically do, I no longer read off bios. So I'm going to ask everybody on the call, starting with, let's start with Martin and go down to Mitch and then go to Sabriya, just because that's
Right.
counterclockwise on my screen. Introduce yourself and just really tell us what brings you to the call today. Martin?
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Great to be here. I am by profession a success coach, trainer, speaker, author. My connection to this issue is that I've spent since about 97 involved in what I call men's work. And my first book was Finding Our Fire, which was a took the dialogues of men asking questions and put them all into a book, keeping them anonymous. And my upcoming book is Taboo: The Lost Codes of Men. And this is something that is very important. I believe the issue around men and suicide and boys is a little bit different and almost never covered or addressed. And I work with a good friend, Tom Golden, that has a book called The Way Men Heal, which I recommend every therapist should buy. And I think this is something that it's critical of how do we support each other in greater wellness and embrace the unique differences that occur. This brings me to this topic. I've also helped as the Raleigh Men's Center, the vice president of the Raleigh Men's Center, I was given the Ron Herring Mission of Service Award from the Mankind Project for my work supporting men. And I've worked on a group called the Proposed White House Council for Boys and Men, which will probably never happen, but they're still working hard to attempt to have something like that. So my involvement with this woven back and forth through my ending of my practice marriage in 95. I went through a very deep depression that, if not helped, could have gone this way as well. And I've been involved with lots of men that have been in many forms of recovery in their life, and see this as an extremely important topic, especially with young people, older people, veterans, all of it. So I'm so grateful you're doing this, Keith. And my card says Google my name. I have about 18,000 pages of content on Google, so you can learn more about me from there. And I'll give some links at the end.
Martin, thank you so much. Mitch, good morning.
Hey, Keith. Thanks for having us. I think in an earlier time zone than everyone else. I'm still kind of waking up, so here we go. My name is Mitc Gray, and I am a personal development and leadership consultant and a life coach. I've spent almost 30 years coaching and counseling people. I use the term counsel loosely. It is wise counsel. I'm not a therapist, but I've also spent most of my life living with a variety of mental health disorders that has led to many bouts of deep depression, a suicide attempt. I've also led and run programs for teenagers that we had about 5,000 teens come through our mental health programs, all dealing with a variety of certain issues. Gosh, I've coached well over 10,000 people in my life, and I have a passion for helping people live deeply meaningful lives. And that is bloody and gory and ugly and beautiful and conscious. And it's just everything, right? This human experience. And so for me, it's about how can we help people, and that begins with helping ourselves. And I think we often forget, and many of us are taught. I was brought up in a very conservatively religious background where we were taught to not take care of ourselves. That was actually a sin to do that. And many people are taught that. As I've really experienced other humans, I can't tell you how many people I have heard from that have said, yes, I was taught the same thing, that we shouldn't care for ourselves and love ourselves. I'm also really big on this idea of contentment. And I'm diving into this idea recently quite a bit because of some life experiences. And I think in our modern world, contentment is a lost art. We're pursuing success, we're pursuing money, we're pursuing whatever things look like. We're working more than we've ever worked. We're making less money on average than we've made in a very long time in modern America, especially. And so when you start putting all these dynamics and elements together, you pose the question, what's happening to our young people? Well, we've really created a recipe for disaster, quite frankly. And so it's really no surprise, in my opinion, that we are where we are. And so conversations like this are very important. But I think spiritual ideas like contentment, spiritual ideas like wisdom, really chasing the sage in all of us rather than the saboteur, really becomes kind of the pursuit that we should be taking. And so I'm excited for this conversation today. Keith, you alluded to you and I's relationship. We've been through it together for a while now. I'm grateful that you're here, my friend, and I'm excited to have a conversation with Martin and Sabriya this morning.
Mitch, thank you so much. And that leaves us to Sabriya. Good morning.
Yes, thank you all. Good morning. It's so great to be here. And, I think about my journey to this work. I remember being that type A perfectionist college student, and also back in high school days. And one day it just came to a head in college. And I think all the things I didn't do the work to address, it began to bubble over. And I remember having some of the worst absolute breakdowns I had ever had in my life. And not only just with the perfectionism, but just even with my own experiences, my family and my life, I never actually did the work. And it took a lot of pain and suffering and therapy to get myself back on track so that I was able to finish. And I actually am an NC State alum. And I remember some of the darkest days of my life were in that experience, and not specifically just associated with NC State, but it was the pressures. It's the combination of all those things that Mitch kind of talked about that I remember really weighing heavy on me that I didn't address. And now it turned into, I'm a mental health professional, and I'm also the founder of a corporate wellness and community wellness company where I provide virtual retreats, on-site programming and trainings and mental health and wellness across various topics like stress management, managing vicarious trauma, being able to overcome anxiety, being able to be productive in the way that's still healthy and considers wellness. One of the biggest landmark things that I've done recently is I actually created a Lead Well program where it's literally a training to develop leadership wellness-oriented leaders or wellness-oriented leaders in the workforce. And so it changes how they approach their teams from a space of empathy, active listening, and other key skills that we teach them. So that's a really big part of my work, and I'm very proud of that. On the mental health side, I run a therapy practice, and I also contract out for an intensive outpatient. So I do lots of therapeutic work, which feeds into my corporate and community work. And one of the things that I'm really big about, like I love how Mitch talked about contentment, and I love how everybody kind of brought about their perspectives, like their angles of why we struggle. For me, I think that one of the key issues that people struggle with is self-trust. And so that's actually the crux of my work. I believe that if we can trust ourselves somatically, physically, and emotionally as humans to navigate decisions, regardless of the consequences, that's where the real power lies. I think that as humans, we try to silo things and we try the thumbs up. Of course, the iPhone, right?
You got him back.
Right, right.
And so, of course, I think as people, we try to silo ourselves where it's either this is all good or this is all bad. But I believe in helping clients understand that there's no such thing as all good or all bad. Assuming we're not doing anything that's really horrible crime. But in general, every choice comes with desirable and undesirable consequences. And so the real power as humans is learning to trust ourselves to navigate all the consequences that come, because consequences are coupled with choices. You can't break them up. They come together. And so I hope that people through today's session maybe gets a perspective of how they can look at suicide differently and maybe look at how they can feel more empowered over their mind. Because I think that we don't realize that we sometimes have the key in our back pocket all along when it comes to our struggles. You know, we are the cage, we are the judge, jury, and executioner. How do we overcome that? And so I look forward to sharing this conversation today with you all.
Great.
Well, I think we're about done with the conversation
that's
based
good.
on everything that I've heard. Martin, what you got, Martin?
No, I think that's terrific what you're doing. So
Thanks.
just seconding it.
And it sounds like, Sabriya, you are way too busy doing many things. And on top of that, I also know from our offline chats that you are going towards your doctorate degree. And so that's even adding to your busyness and hopefully your productivity moving forward. So one, congratulations on that. I know it's a journey in and of itself because I've taken that journey. But let's go ahead and get started with this particular conversation. And I want to tap into the fact that all of us here on the call, except for me professionally, well, that's not true either, because I was a mental health professional. My first degree out of college was social work. So I was a mental health professional in North Carolina, in the eastern part of the states, for over a decade. But all of us here have struggled personally and have professionally invested our lives in other human beings. And so we recognize the fact that if we don't do that, both as an individual and other people and as a community to surround ourselves, because we heal, we build, we create through community. Let's start there. Let's start our conversation there. And then from that, I want to talk about wellness, because all of you have addressed wellness in one form or another, and that's part of this conversation. So let's start with the idea of community. How do we create then a community that really empowers each other rather than what we're seeing, especially through social media, where we see a lot of belittling, a lot of bullying, just a lot of negativity rather than empowerment. Typically, I say, I don't really care who goes first. Today, I'll do the same. I don't care who jumps in first. Somebody's got to. Martin, how about you?
Okay.
How would we start with community, and what is community around wellness?
Well, community around wellness, it's important to first understand that we all have different ways of handling stress. We all have different ways of handling crisis that occurs. So understand we've got to create community that you embraces the unique differences that people have around this. So I'll just take the example of the men's work I've done. One of the key missing pieces with the therapeutic system is my friend Tom Golden, who is the therapist I recommend getting the information on. He was put into a community as the only male in a high-risk suicide type therapeutic environment. And all the women therapists said, you're going to get all the men. And he got the men that were high risk and applied what he learned as a therapist in training years ago. And the suicide rate went up, not down. And he went, I got to either change this or get out of the field. And he looked at it and went, everything I was taught was different from what it looked like men needed. That by getting into their feelings first, it pushed them closer to suicide, that the unique core masculine really needed to address what activities they need to do to honor the loss. And so he was in a community where he was pretty isolated and alone and had to transform this or get out. And he really developed his whole work that he's spent his life building on that's outstanding from there. And I can give a quick story of this. I was at my friend's house that I've known literally before, I think, kindergarten, and his wife has known that I'm more emotional than he is, and her husband. And she says, after his dad died, he didn't grieve. And I said, yes, he did. And she says, no, he didn't. He didn't grieve the loss of his father. And I said, well, what did he do? He says, well, instead of grieving, he transformed the backyard into this. He rebuilt it. He re-landscaped it. He changed everything into this beautiful environment. And I said to her, where did he play with his father growing up? And she said, in the backyard. And I said, that was his grieving. But because we aren't talking about the unique way that the masculine often grieves, and our therapeutic system generally doesn't even address it. I've had 5 men from my men's group who've gone through training, and this wasn't addressed in their training as a therapist. that was his grieving. And so I'm talking as far as community, what we need to do is we need to make sure we're acknowledging all aspects. Now, this is not black and white. It's like a bell curve. The core, I say the core, if the core is masculine, this applies, but that doesn't mean a woman can't have this core. It's more like a bell curve. So this is not a black and white issue. And this type of thing is important. If we're truly going to embrace everyone, we must embrace people that we don't like, we don't agree with, that are different. And that's, to me, the beginning of community, is that we start with that. And one of my rules is, if someone's really annoying me or even pissing me off, I need to get to know them better, because there might be some shadow side of myself I'm not addressing. So as far as community, I think this is one of the absolute, I believe, the root cause of actually violence, suicide, and so forth. So young men that don't have support in maturing and honoring the actual positive of being masculine will either act out or act in. Act in is suicide, act out is hurting other people. So I think the beginning of building community is we need to look at the holes where we're not looking and make sure we're embracing that first.
Martin, thank you so much. And it was a great story. Sabriya, sorry.
No, I love that, Martin. You were bringing up a lot of thoughts for me, and I want to talk about grieving later today, because that's a really big part of the work that I do and I believe in. And grieving more than just like, as in, people think grief is always just about death, right? Grief is so much more, and so I'd love to dive in that more. But one thing I want to say is, when we think about the roots of humanity, like when we think about our deepest, oldest ancestors, loneliness actually meant death. And so according to science, our brains are actually wired to have a sense of community, because if you were an outcast in a tribe or in your community, it probably meant you weren't going to survive. And so you were stuck with your own thoughts and your own survival. And I'm sure many of those outcasts probably took their lives before they even had to be at the arms of a saber-toothed tiger or a wildebeest, right? Or something out there, right? So I think that we don't realize how much community is a huge part of us. I mean, there's even research that said that loneliness can be just as bad as smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. I mean, it's some serious stuff. It's a psychological, biological experience for us. And so community is, to me, I see it as seeing the humanity in all of us. One thing that we all share in this life's experience is death. We all know that we're not going to get out of this thing alive, no matter what we do, no matter how perfect we are. That's the one shared experience we're guaranteed. And I think it's important as humans that we remember that, everybody's humanity is sacred. And just as Martin said, everybody has a unique spirit about them that we have to honor. And honor doesn't have to mean concurrence, right? You don't have to agree with someone to be able to honor and see the humanity in them. And I think that that's one of the things that we lack as a people, is that we dehumanize groups or people in order to feel better about ourselves, or maybe to feel a sense of control, or because we're afraid. And I think that's one of the things where we fall short as a society and as a humanity. And I think it's important that we realize that community is really about saying, how can I meet you in your existence somewhere? We all can meet somewhere on this crossroads called life. Even if I can't connect with your actual experience, I can connect with the emotions behind your experience. And that's how I teach empathy. And what Brene Brown says, empathy is about connecting to the emotion that that person is experiencing, and being able to say, while I might not be angry about this specific incident that you're feeling, I can resonate with the feeling of anger. I know what that means. I know what it means to grieve. I know what it means to be depressed, right? So I think that's one of the biggest things we can do as a society is, one, stop getting to this place where we're popularizing being lonely. Loneliness is not the goal, number one. I think a lot of social media is like, oh, I can be on my own. I should be on my own. I think that we need to change that mindset, that loneliness is to be celebrated. We want to find ways to be alone is okay, but to create an environment of loneliness is dangerous, as Martin mentioned. And I think that community starts with being curious. Hey, can you tell me more about your life? Can I understand your life more? And people will be surprised that the power of a listening ear can be all they ever really needed.
I have to add something wonderful you said. Curiosity is such a powerful tool to be able to break through your own biases. It's like, treat it like another world, and you're just exploring it with curiosity is a disruption. For we all have a bias, we all have a judgment, but go, oh, that's interesting over there. So that was such an important piece you brought up.
Thank you.
Mitch, that brings us to you.
Yeah, I want to piggyback on something Sabriya said in her intro, and that was the idea of trust. When I think of community, I think of building. There has to be an intentional building process, because community doesn't tend to just kind of happen evolutionarily. It really takes an intent, and it takes a purpose-driven action, multiple actions over time to build trust. But where does that trust begin? Before I can truly trust you, I have to trust me. And that's where we find the barrier of building community. Is it's really hard for me to feel that you're a safe space when I know I am not a safe space. It's really difficult for me to trust you with my emotional value when I know I don't trust myself with that emotional value. And so what we do then is we have all these surface relationships that may be built at the bar, or they're built at church, or they're built at work, or they're built within families. I mean, we can go decades within a family environment and only have surface relationships. And that's because we don't trust ourselves. And so I had a friend recently, and I'm speaking to this a little bit and probably resonating with it because I'm experiencing this personally. I had a friend recently that said, Mitch, you keep your cards way too close to the chest. And he was right. And when I really dig into the root of why I hold my cards so close, it's because I don't trust myself in the way I should. And so therefore I don't trust others in the way that builds community. And it seems, a lot of people ask the question, why is it during times of trial and tribulation that we come together as a community? It's because we're forced to trust something greater than ourselves. So when I'm in a time of tribulation, challenge, and trial, I can then trust something bigger than me, which is a community, either universally or locally. And then I can also trust myself because, to Sabriya's point, in a time of trial and tribulation, I don't have time to overthink. I don't have time to take inventory of all the things I failed at. I just have to take action and make a decision, not so much worried about what the result of the decision is. And that's really how we should be living life most of the time, is just simply making the decisions, not so worried about where they're going to fall, but just trusting that they're going to fall out for our best interest. But it's really hard for me to trust other people when I can't trust myself. And the caveat to that is we get burned. We just do. As long as we're in community, we're going to get stabbed in the back. We're going to get burned because humans are humans. And all of these other humans within the community are making their own decisions. And so we just have to live with some grace and some mercy and some empathy and compassion, beginning in the mirror and then extending it to others around us. But to really think about community, it doesn't happen by happenstance. It really has to take intention and action and a purpose-driven decision to say, I'm going to work on the community of self, and then I'm going to extend that community to other people around me.
No, I've had conversations, and so I'm just going to add my piece to this part of the conversation. I have conversations with a lot of people all the time, and I've been doing this intentionally. Now I'm doing it intentionally, but at least for the past 2 to 3 years. And so from my second suicide attempt, it was my intention to start reaching out to people, both known people I've just knew, whether professionally or socially, a lot of it through LinkedIn, because that was really my only list of connections. And so then I started reaching out to people, perfect strangers, and I just simply tapped on their virtual door and said, would you like to have a conversation? Just like we're having now. Now, these are more intentional, but when I started with the Question Guy podcast, it was really about hearing about people's personal stories, and then allowing that space, creating that space where people became comfortable sharing their story and sharing that pain and sharing the frustration and sharing the transition that they were making because they wanted to see change in their own lives. And so from that time, 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago to today, I've been making the intentional efforts to have conversations so that two things can happen at the very least, Mitch, is that people can kind of tap into themselves and learn to trust themselves, and then for me to do the same thing, and then build a space where that trust can kind of grow and blossom. And so I want to transition now from the idea of community of people to a community of self and talk about wellness. There's so much talk about self-care, and I'll put that in air quotes. I hear that a lot on LinkedIn. A lot of the people who I'm connected with address self-care. If we're not taking care of ourselves, we can't do everything else because we'll bottom out. We'll get frustrated. We'll burn out. We'll have all those things that cause us to have maladaptive behaviors is kind of what I'm using, and that's not what we want to do. We want to be able to grow, blossom, and mature as individuals. And so, what does for each of you, please?
Yeah, I want to.
Self-care look like?
I love this topic. I get excited about because it's funny. I actually like to define it for people. So with my clients, and especially my corporate work, one of the trainings that I like to do is explain that there's two types of self-care. I mean, of course, there's nuances, but there's internal and external self-care. To me, internal self-care is the self-soothing talk. That's the affirmations, right? It's prayer, it's meditation. It's the things that we do internally for ourselves to cope with the situation. Whereas external self-care is going to be things that you do to change your environment. That means communicating boundaries, changing where you're working, changing where you're living. So it's going to be more of an active decision that you make to outside to manipulate your environment on the outside, right? So it's more of an active and proactive decision. And so oftentimes when I talk to people about their stressors, I ask them to first categorize them. Is this a stressor that is controllable? Is this a stressor that is out of your control? Or is the stressor that you can influence, where it's a little bit of both? You can control some parts and not control some parts. If it's things we cannot control, then you have to really lean on to self-care. And if it's things that you can control, you can do self-care and external action within that self-care to make that change. So if it's I'm late to work every time I wake up, then it's taking that extra moment to maybe have a better bedtime routine so that you can wake up more refreshed in the morning, setting up a more of a schedule for yourself. So that's the first thing I want to do is kind of define it and break it up in those two ways. That's how I perceive it. And I think that self-care is definitely, people all think it's bubble baths and music, which those are great, but it's a unique fingerprint to every person. What works for me might not work for you, might not work for the next person. And so I think it's important for people to experiment. I think we're afraid oftentimes to experiment with what works for us, but it's okay to go out and try things to see if this equates to self-care for you. Last year, I did an activity called the Year of the Hummingbird, and it's a whole long story. I love hummingbirds. And one day I was talking to my husband and I said, hummingbirds, they just literally like fly around and like drink sugar all day. Like, I mean, they just do whatever and they live their best life. Like, I just want to be a hummingbird. And he was like, well, then go be a hummingbird. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And that year I was like, well, I'm going to be a hummingbird, dog on it. And so every month I tried something new that I've always been interested in, but I didn't know if I would do it. So from goat yoga to the sensory deprivation float tank to knitting or I think it was crocheting actually, to crocheting, to going to a rage room. I tried everything. I went to an improv class, tried Pilates. Every single month I was doing something different and I documented my journey. And it was one of the most life-changing opportunities to really figure out what gets me excited, what makes me feel calm, what makes me feel at peace, what makes me feel inspired. And so that's my biggest recommendation is to experiment with self-care. Make it a fun process because it changes even over time. Something you loved 5 years ago, you might not love it now, and that's okay.
I think that's extraordinary. And one aspect I want to throw in with self-care is also self-confidence. I've talked at my university with the graduate class and seen a large number of wonderful, talented young people that have more skills than me and no self-confidence. And I think there are two aspects of this that are important. One is what you talked about is in taking risk and moving outside your comfort zone. The other is failure is the doorway for confidence. That people patting you on the back your whole life, saying you're great when you know you aren't, is a great way to embed depression, possibly on the path to suicide. And so I believe my generation did a profound disservice with their young people in over acknowledging them and not giving them room to fail. You know, Tom's done some work on how fathers contribute to compassion in a child. And when the father tells the child, you don't get to eat your ice cream until after you finish your vegetables, it forces the child to see from another perspective. And so there are two aspects to this. One is failure is a doorway to self-care. The other one is beyond feelings, what are we committed to? And I think this conversation isn't enough because in my own world, I was put in fourth grade, I was put in what we called back then the retarded class, which is a really cruel term. And we were cruel to these kids. And then I was there. Well, what I didn't know as a fourth grader is I had a reading challenge and she was the only tutor. But to me, I must be one of them. And we made fun of them. And then I made up a whole story around it. It only took till I was 35 to change. But the reference point out of it, diagnosed with some dyslexia and ADD, was what am I committed to here? And it's also important in communities to go to the highest level we can agree upon. And I think we don't talk enough about what is your commitment in this environment. We actually overgo to the feelings, and we see it in social media. I call it a socialized narcissism. Look at me, look at me, look at me. Oh, I have to admit, I'm depressed. Well, of course you are. Your life's all about you. Why aren't you depressed? So I think some of the components in self-care is commitment, and also the giving us permission of some of the activities you did over that time period of full engagement in a activity can also be self-care. It's not just meditation. And I want to share a profound insight when I went to Japan briefly on this is I wanted to study what perfect balance was. And we toured these different temples and shrines, and we're on a tour guide, and I asked, why do the monks have these barrels of sake stacked on the wall? I mean, aren't they meditating and balancing their lives? And she explained, well, twice a year we have a such and such ceremony, and they open the sake with the town, and then they have the fire ceremony. And I said to my friend, would you translate this? So basically, twice a year, the monks would sit there and meditate, have a break open party where everyone gets drunk. They're holding torches, almost burn down the town, and then they go back and meditate. And the little woman with a flag says, after it was translated, yes, that's correct. And I realized we underestimate the importance of some of us need a big enough resistor to engage us for wellness, and we're pushing always to the balance piece of it. And you look at some of the most successful people that really do have pretty good lives, they don't always look like they're balanced. They're fully engaged in what's a constructive use of them. It's like Richard Bandler said, there's a job for every neuroses. We just have to match them up. And so I think this is two things: commitment, and also understanding that for some, self-care means we actually are more engaged in the right activity. And the third thing is, sometimes witnessing our feelings, not just honoring our feelings. And making mistakes is such an important point in building actual confidence.
Martin, I want to get back to that whole idea of making mistakes in a little bit, because I know you've mentioned it twice now, so I do want to circle back to it.
Sure.
I want to hear Mitch, self-care.
Yeah, I first of all love Sabriya's two definitions. I think those are really on point. And Martin, I think balance is a mythological unicorn that we may or may not ever find. Who really knows? And we're, I heard someone the other day say, I just want to find balance. And I'm like, well, what is that? And it's an ever evolving, it's just so mythological. So I love that story about your experience in Japan. I've read enough Zen Buddhist monk material that I have no doubt that story is on point. So I want to go a little more practical, kind of the tip of the iceberg a little bit. And that is to add to what both of you said, I really believe that once you find the type of self-care you're attracted to that connects with you, that having daily routines centered around those self-care pillars is so critically important. And the reason I believe it's important, I like to call them anchors, is that I've seen this in other people's lives. I've experienced it, that when you can have an anchor to draw upon, when your world is shattered, and life is going to shatter you at some point in time, and all of us respond differently to the waves that life brings us. But when your world is shaken and shattered, when you have nothing else to turn to, but maybe that one routine, maybe that one anchor, when you can hold on to that, when all hope is lost, there's something that happens cognitively in the physical function of the brain through neural pathways. And there's something that happens emotionally that allows us to say, okay, I at least have this hacky sack. I at least have the bubble bath. I at least have my yoga class. I at least have my daily reading. my meditation. And I think where people often disconnect from their anchors is there are moments that you don't feel it, that you would prefer the sake over the meditation. And so we often push ourselves away from the anchor because we are emotionally disconnected at that moment in time. But if you're watching this or listening and you ever find yourself emotionally disconnected, do it anyway. Do not take that as the sign to stop, but actually as the green light to go. Because that emotional disconnection is actually your survival brain clicking in because you're going through a moment of crisis. And when we go through a moment of crisis, our left brain kicks in because we feel the danger of the animal lurking. Those are the moments that you hold closer to your anchors. And so I would suggest, to play on Sabriya's point about creativity and exploration, do that when you feel good. Do the exploration and the creativity when you feel really good. It's like, don't make a hard decision when you feel bad. Do the creativity when you feel good, so that when your earth is shaken, you have an anchor to draw upon and you have something to cling to. That's why I love routine. And I think I'm as creative as anyone else. I love creativity, but I just learned that daily routine, those daily habits, those daily anchors can really keep sanity close when it feels like it's maybe far away.
Great points.
So just to speak to that a little bit, I am a man of routine, and anybody who knows me personally knows that I don't live without a routine. I mean, I literally have my alarm clock getting up at, at this point, 2:30 in the morning, and that's only because I'm training for the Appalachian Trail through hike, and that's 2025, and so that's a different story altogether. So I get up, I have breakfast, I do a 12-mile hike, I have another breakfast because I'm hungry. I go to work, I have these conversations. And so I am a man of routine, but so I do have anchors. And so when I was facing my, trauma, in 2021, I was facing my trauma. Aside from, Mitch saying, breathe and show up, which he told me every day, breathe and show up. I was still doing my routines, which was kind of, once I showed up and, got out of bed, I was still, eating breakfast and at least walking every day because I'm old and I don't run anymore. But I like the idea, and I'm not a person to do this, Sabriya. I'm not a person to do new things. Really odd because, and you said you wanted to try all of those things that you just wanted to know about. They were kind of an interest point to you. For somebody like me who wouldn't touch something new for the sake of nothing, how do you encourage people in your line of work to kind of, find those interest points, expand your world? Maybe we need to do more of that. Maybe I need to do more of that.
Oh, I like that. I love that this
I'm
is
not saying I
spreading.
will. I'm just saying maybe I should.
Everybody needs to do a Year of the Hummingbird. I highly recommend it. Loved it. So, I think one thing I like to do with the clients is I like to go back to the good old Cartesian square. And so to me, that's this model where it's, if I do this, what good can come from it? If I do this, what bad could come from it? If I don't do this, what good could come from it? If I don't do this, what bad can come from it? And I help people really dive into, what are the real potential risk or consequences? So I like to have people also do fear setting work where I'm like, okay, let's say you do it. What's the worst that can happen? What's the best that can happen? How can you prevent the worst and how can you repair the worst? Right. And most likely, I tell people it's somewhere between the worst and the best that you end up getting that outcome. It's rarely that it's one or the other. It's usually somewhere on the spectrum in between. There's much more space in the middle of the spectrum than it is in the outside, right? When it comes to that, just like Martin was talking about the bell curve, there's a lot more that can happen. The statistical probability is a lot more in the middle than it is on those extremes, right? And so I think by helping people really break down those blocks that have caused them to believe that they can't repair, aka don't trust themselves to repair or prevent things, breaking that down and helping them understand what skills and strengths they actually do carry, what unique qualities that equip them for life, because we all are equipped for life way more than we think. And by helping them actually understand and define that is the game changer, in my opinion. And so, it's a process. I definitely think it takes time, and I think it's about doing it slowly, right? So I like to say we do like a thing in therapy. It's like the ladder, where we go on the ladder of risk. We don't start off doing the craziest thing on our list. We start off with something tiny. Have a conversation with a stranger when you're at the coffee shop. Ask them a little extra question besides, how was your day? Ask them a little something more. So it's the little things. And so I actually have clients build ladders of fear where they start with little things and they do more and more complicated things. And then now I have clients that are moving across the state and doing all kinds of things they've always wanted to do because they're able to build that confidence from the little things.
Well, I do appreciate that. And so
I have to add
Go ahead,
something
Martin. Go
because
ahead.
when I was giving a presentation to the business class in St. Andrews University, my university, I sat down and wrote down a bunch of just like Martin sayings I just made up, and they were to pick in the class what got their attention the best. And then I made a T-shirt. It's on Amazon on it, and it is, if your life is boring, it's because you're boring. Life begins outside your comfort zone. That's the exact quote. And it was so cute because the class voted that was the most profound. And I go, I'm not sure it's that profound. I said, okay, if you're here next year, I'll have a T-shirt. I gave away a T-shirt. You can get it. That's what it says. And to me, Keith, that's actually the answer to your question. You see, in the moment where things seem boring, maybe it's time to get outside the comfort zone.
Maybe it is. I've not found my life to be boring. Maybe others
I understand.
may see it.
Yeah.
But I'm very much living within my comfort zone. But actually, every conversation I have is a risk because I never know what's going to happen in that conversation. So I've been training myself to have conversations better, and so I'm having better conversations. But I do appreciate your point. I want to hit two more topics before we give our audience something to do, not just hope, but something to do as a result of this conversation. So I want to go back to your point, Martin. Making mistakes is a part of life, but we don't necessarily see them as a good thing. And so I want each of the three of you to address that. And then finally, we're going to talk about how do we handle grief in a better way. And so I want to talk about mistakes first, and then transition into dealing with grief because we all have to face it at some time. Martin, because it was your topic.
Yeah, okay. I'm just trying not to
make a mistake.
Give room for everyone. I want to give the example of when I trained in comedy at Charlie Goodnight's with my good friend Raj Bates. And I have been speaking in front of people forever. So I knew what was best. So I really didn't listen to him. So when I got on stage, I thought, I'm funny. People think I'm funny when I'm training. I'll handle this. And I get on stage. It's a room full of drunk people with blinding lights where I can't see them. And I'm telling things that I think are funny. And I'm actually noticing they're booing. They're actually booing at me. And then I went, well, I guess it's time for me to leave the stage. And I remember driving home and going, wow, first of all, I was just beyond humiliated. I mean, it was just, I admire my friend. He's a teacher. I didn't listen. And I was literally booed off stage in Charlie Goodnight's. In fact, they now have a rule for the stand-up comedy, no booing of the comic that's in training. Okay. So then I noticed, wait a second, what am I committed to? This gets back to the commitment. See, this is the tool to get through the emotions. And I went, well, I'm committed to teaching and being a great trainer. I went, well, I'm experiencing some of the top humiliation of my life, except when my girlfriend left me in the dance. And anyway, so this is something I'm experiencing. Why don't you experience humiliation fully? So I'm driving home going, wow, this is what deep humiliation is. What's the next action? I need to take the class again. I did. And they actually, and I listened to him, and Raj Bates is a great teacher. And I was at the end, one of the top comics that overseas walked up and says, that's one of the best acts. That was good original material. Nothing was hacked. And so I did 3 minutes of comedy out of another 6 weeks. And that has carried with me in public speaking and being better at handling problems, because I believe the most important thing in building that confidence and making mistakes is also learn to let yourself be embarrassed, or someone said, oh, he busted my chops and I had to respond. No, you don't have to respond. Learn from it. So I believe the core of confidence is that, but then the latter idea, which I love, it doesn't mean you have to go to the biggest failure. They're micro little trials and errors, but then you have to go back to the commitment of where you're going with this. And that builds true confidence, which builds trusting yourself inside. So thanks for letting me share my story of boot off
Absolutely.
stage at the comedy
Awesome.
club.
That's wow. Mitch, how about you? How do we live through making mistakes?
Yeah, I think I love this idea that Sabriya introduced in the beginning, and that is trust. I think it all goes back to trusting yourself and just trusting that no matter what mistake you make or that happens, because oftentimes we view something as a mistake and it's the best thing that ever happens to us. Kind of to Martin's point about his story. My question would be, was that really a mistake? Was that really the most humiliating thing? Because we don't really know until we see the end result.
Mm-hmm.
And I would suggest in Martin's story that that's not the most humiliating thing that's ever happened to him because of what permission it gave him to move forward with boldness, with confidence, and with opportunity. And so mistake is kind of like balance, right? It's a little bit mythical in what it really means. Some of the worst things that happen to us actually become the most beautiful things that could have happened to us. And so I think that's the first step, is really changing our perception of what a mistake really is. And then I think the second thing is trusting ourselves and trusting the universe, that no matter what happens in this moment, even in the darkest of dark, no matter what happens in this moment, we can trust ourselves because we know what's best for ourselves. We can trust the community around us if we've built one. And I would even say that I believe most humans want the best for other humans. I think the ones that we see about on the news are the few and far between. And so I think you could even reach out to a stranger in a moment of crisis, and that stranger would want nothing more than to help you. And so we have more of a community around us than we may actually believe that we have. So trusting that community, trusting that when you reach out for help, someone will show up. It may not be the person you thought, and the people that you think may show up may not, but someone in that moment will show up for you if you reach out. And I want to give real quick, just because we're talking about suicide, there are national crisis lines that you can call where someone will show up for you in that moment. And so the mistakes are about perception. It's about trusting yourself and trusting those around you. And it's really about knowing that I can get through this at the end of the day. No matter how much crisis and trauma I'm going through, I am resilient. I can get through this. And it could possibly be the most beautiful thing that's happening to me because of the changes that it's going to motivate, inspire, and bring about.
I have to add one comment. Then when they're a little different slant, I actually think it's important that we allow failure to exist and not be failure. I think we deny ourselves a certain level of humanity when we don't allow the word failure to exist and differentiate us as not failure. So, which is not in conflict, Mitch, with what you're saying, but just an important distinction I want to add to that is there's great power that I can even fail, and then I have a commitment to operate on, to improve on, has improved my confidence more than I used to be a manic optimist where I must label everything as positive. And again, Mitch, this isn't with you, but I denied a certain level of humanity. It's just like grief is what if we go into grief, then that's what is healthy in life, versus if we don't, then it pulls us down towards something that might be completely self-destructive. So yeah, I just wanted to make that little distinction in my experience. It's very important. It was okay. I was humiliated and I failed. because that gave me great power to distinguish myself from being failure. So yeah, thanks.
It's my Zen Buddhism coming out.
No, but I want to show both, Mitch.
You're
Neither
exactly
are
right.
You understand, Mitch? Neither are right.
No,
Just
yeah,
different
and you're exactly right. That it is a perception, and you are able to perceive. For some people, and I was one of them, where failure was not an option as a kid. I have a lot of trauma around that I'm working through, and a lot of people do. For you, it was different because, to Sabriya's point earlier, all of our experiences are so different. And my question would be, what is failure?
Right.
Which leaves room for the definition of whatever you need to get through that moment in time. And so I love what you're saying. And that's exactly right.
No,
it's all about perception.
Sabrina, I want you to go first, but
I love definitions work. That's huge for me, especially in couples therapy. I think it's so important for us to define what things mean to us. Humans, we all have a different definition of failure, success, and everything in between. This is kind of something that Dr. Keith and I had kind of touched on in our one-on-one that we had a while back. I believe that as humans, we have to accept that we can only live one version of the universe at a time. And I say this in the way of, we oftentimes try to step into other universes where if I shoulda, coulda, woulda, but the thing is, you're not in that universe. And I tell people all the time that we can only walk in one version of a universe at a time. And we might hop between because we make whole new choices that put us on whole new paths, but we cannot live two choices at once. If you don't make a choice, you make a choice. If you do make a choice, you make a choice. And if you pick something in between, you're still making a choice. And at the end of the day, as humans, we have to accept that if we knew what we knew, then we probably wouldn't have done that, right? If it didn't give us the result that we wanted. But that's a part of living in our universe. We can only see what's in front of us. And then, of course, we can look back and say, this is what this experience meant to me after it has happened. And so what I think the real power is surrounding yourself with people who can help celebrate you in the time that you're falling, especially those who are struggling with suicidality. You don't need people who are going to weaponize your failures. You don't need people who are going to continue to bring up your failures, bring up your past. That's one of the biggest demons that I think many people with suicide face, is their past, is their enemy. And I think that if you knew what you knew now, you probably may have not made that choice if it ended up not getting the outcome you desired, right? We know some failures can result in something that we actually ended up liking, or some failures can actually result in something that didn't make us happy. For example, one of the failures that I had that I ended up turning out well, similar to Martin's, was I had went to NC State knowing that I was going to be a veterinarian. I was gung-ho. This girl did all the internships in high school. I was working my little $8 an hour job on the weekends, giving up my Saturdays at an emergency vet clinic, cleaning up, burying dogs, or not burying, but bagging up dead dogs, unfortunately, because that happened a lot when you're in the emergency vet clinic, and doing all the wildest things I've ever seen in my life, from blood and guts and everything. And, I was so deeply committed. And one day, I think I was a junior at that point, something started to hit me. And I was like, I like animals, but like, not like this. Like, I don't necessarily want to work with them full time like this. I love dogs. I like cows and all that, but I don't know about this. And it was so scary, because imagine having an animal science degree that you're almost done with, and you're in this situation. Fortunately, I got really excited when Dr. Keith talked about the social work, because I also had a dual degree in social work, because it was a program that I was a part of, the Jefferson Scholars, that allowed me to have two types of degree programs that I was in. So I finally made the decision junior year, and I said, I am not going to go to vet school. I'm not doing this. And I felt like a complete failure. Imagine your whole life telling everybody you're going to be a veterinarian and realizing that's not the path you're going to take. I mean, I did so many jobs, from marketing. I graduated with a full-time real estate job. I was in higher ed, and I found myself now in this space of mental health and wellness and therapy and corporate wellness and community wellness. And it has been a life-changing journey. And I would not change the choices I made back then, because they were so crucial for my universe, for me to get where I am. I learned a little bit from every career type, every experience I had. I can bring that into the present. The science of my animal science degree still applies to the science of mental health knowledge. The chemicals are similar. I mean, it's you don't always know what pieces are being built for your life until you live life. Kind of like how Mitch was saying, where you don't really know what the outcome will be until you allow life to play out. And so that's the number one thing I tell clients, is allow your life to play out. Allow things to play out. Then you can get a chance to get on the chessboard again and make that next move. But remember, we have to stick with our universe that we're in. We have to stick with our existence that we're in and make peace with the fact that everything can be hindsight 2020 if we want it, depending on how we look at it.
And Keith, I want to add to that. One of the best kind of idealisms that was shared with me a while back ago was I did the best I could in that moment in time with what I had.
Mm-hmm.
And that's that grace and compassion and empathy for self. That could potentially be the greatest form of self-care, is knowing and giving myself the space to know I did the best I could at that moment in time with what I had. And it doesn't mean that we didn't make decisions that were just totally decisions we shouldn't have made, because we're talking about mistakes, right? But to give ourselves that grace and compassion to say, look, I did the best I could at that moment in time with what I was equipped to do with. And that keeps us from shoulding all over ourselves, to Sabriya's point earlier, because we do. And that's just, we live in the past universe so often. All of us do. I wish I would have done this. I wish I would have done this differently. And we just can't go backwards. There is no past. There is no future. All we have is this moment. I did the best I could with what I had in that moment in time. And that's all there is.
So let's take a look at this. We've all been on a journey today. So for the past hour, and that's what I typically do with the Envision Speaker Series. The guests, the panel members that I bring to the table, the virtual table, I know all have their metaphors, their stories, and their applications. And so we take that, I kind of orchestrate that. So we all take a journey. We all take a journey for ourselves, because we all learned something about ourselves today in the past hour and about each other. And so we're going to take and choose what we can benefit from this conversation. And so I'm not quite sure. And typically I do this by instinct at this time, because I'm intuitive and have learned to listen to what's going on in the conversation. The last point I wanted to address was grief, but maybe we should address it in not so much its negative connotation, because it can go down a deep hole that we may not need to go down to right now. But if we address it in terms of all the decisions I've made to today brings me, when I was facing my trauma, to a decision. Do I want to live? Do I not want to live? That's a difficult decision to come against. I faced it twice. And you look back and you say, and we may be our worst critics. Every bad decision, and even this good decisions that I made, brought me to this point. Why is this now the ultimate decision that I've got to make in my life? And so I don't want to go there specifically, but I want to say, if we are the result of all of the decisions that we make, good and bad, how can we then change our mindset, our perspective, our thoughts about ourselves, and create a new, what I typically call a mental model? How do we create a new model around who we are that just tells us, today I'm okay and I'm good to be okay? Because if I'm okay today, I can be okay tomorrow. If I'm okay tomorrow, I can be okay the next day. So I want to transition now with the four of us here, because we are going to leave something empowering with our audience. How important is it for us to be okay today with who we are?
That one is so good. So good.
And I'm a doctor, but I'm not a medical doctor. Although I wanted to be a medical doctor. And this is to y'all's point. When I learned that I had to go into a morgue and cut people open as part of that training, going in there, I said no. That was not the type of doctor I was going to be. And here I am, a doctor of education. And so how important is it to be okay with ourselves today?
I believe straight up, we have to grieve what is and what isn't. And I bring grief back. And I said I was going to circle back with that because we as humans, we have expectations that we have to let go of other people in our lives, especially even loved ones. I think back on my journey, oftentimes one of the biggest things that starts a spiral of struggle and suicidality is our caretakers, our parents, right? And our attachments with them. And I think because we get so caught up in who we hoped our mom would be or who we hoped our dad would be, we get lost in that. And I think that it starts to pain us because then we start to wonder where we went wrong. If we had just been this person, then this person would be this person. But we have to grieve that sometimes our expectations are just simply beyond us. And we cannot, they're beyond what, we can't control what other people are and what they'll become. And so when we can let go and grieve that version that we have in our head of other people, and sometimes the version we have of ourselves that's not realistic, and I'm not saying that we can't have dreams and goals and expectations, but when we get to that point where things become unrealistic, we lose touch with ourselves. And so I think we have to release that and allow ourselves to just be okay with what is. What is exactly what it needs to be, where it is right now in this space, in this time, in this moment, at this present. That's not to say you can't be somebody totally different tomorrow. But can you just, at this point, can we grieve who we're trying to expect to be for others today so that we can truly step into who we are today?
Yeah, and I think that idea goes back to the idea of contentment, right? It's being content. And that's a jagged pill to swallow. I mean, just to put it as honestly as sometimes, not all the time. But oftentimes that means we're accepting things that we just flat out don't want to accept. And that is kind of the grieving process, right? Is this idea of life isn't in this moment what I hoped it would be, but it is, period. It just is what it is at this moment in time. And being content in some form or fashion with how it's turned out. And, I've always had a saying ever since really in 2004, I came up with this mantra, and that is, I'm always going to show up for myself and for others. I've changed that a little bit to become, okay, I'm going to show up, but how am I going to show up? And then very recently, my best friend reminded me, nothing changes if you don't show up. Nothing changes if you don't show up. And so this mantra that I created in 2004, because I wanted to show up for myself after going through a very dark season, has really evolved into, okay, how am I going to show up? And nothing changes if we don't show up. And that's really what I hear when I hear you talking about, look, life is what it is at this point in time. We can't remake decisions. We can just do our best to equip ourselves to not revisit those decisions, because the universe has this weird thing that it does. And that is, it brings you back to a certain point in time over and over again until you learn the lesson. It's this crazy phenomenon that I've found. It's like, I've seen this before. I've seen this act before. Why am I revisiting this? Well, it's because you probably haven't learned what needs to be learned at that moment in time. And it's a different face and a different space, but it's like the same feeling that just arises. Like, I've been here before. Rob Bell calls it the video game of life. It's like you have to face the certain level and fight the dragon until you defeat the dragon. And I think that's a really kind of cool analogy, but it's just this idea of contentment and just being okay. I like to call it living within the okayness of how life has turned out. And that does take a grieving process. And I just want to tell people, it's flat out okay to not be complete. Contentment and happiness are two very different things. In fact, I'm kind of eradicating happiness from my definition of life. It's like, I want the joy. Happiness is a bit elusive. And it's like, it's okay to be frustrated. And it's okay to be a little stressed about where life is right now. And it's okay to feel the anxiety of how things have turned out. What's not okay is to sit in that and just continue to beat yourself up. Nothing changes if you don't show up. So please show up and just begin with that first step.
And I want to add one little piece on Mitch said, because Mitch, I was loving what you were saying. One thing I want to say is, I always say you're unique, but you're not unique. Like, your challenges are unique, but they're not, right? Like, you're not the only one who's been down this road. And I tell clients all the time, this is not new. Like this is new, but it's not new in the same way. So I
Yeah.
love the idea that we do find ourselves in the same journey. And my mantra that I like to use is these things happen. And I love it. It's such a
Yep.
comforting phrase to me. These things happen. So I love that you brought up mantras. So I just want to throw those in there. Great stuff.
While you're talking, reflecting on the dark point after my practice marriage ended in 95. And I was realizing when I was at the darkest point, it's okay right now that I'm living for my parents, because if I weren't here, then I wouldn't be around to take care of them. And I want to add one of the pieces is it's okay to have props. It's okay to use something else in those darkest points to get you through the next day. And another aspect of it is going into it, I felt there was nothing I was of value. There was nothing I could do right. And I realized I got to find something that I can acknowledge to myself, let in that I do right. And this is going to sound funny, but I realized I can open a door competently every time. And unless you've been in those dark places, it's hard to understand. So I took a door, I always turn it right, and the door opens. And so it's okay to find the little things to that you can let in a time when it seems like it's hard to let things in. And the last is just really seeking small things that you can be grateful for that exist, and using the props one day at a time and moving forward.
So let's build on that. So each of you, please leave something with the audience, those who are watching and or listening, something to do today as a result of this conversation, whenever they hear it, if they're listening to it now or 5 years from now, because it's going to stay on YouTube as long as YouTube keeps my channel up. Give somebody something to do so that they can make today okay.
I'll start with find something you can be grateful for, either in life or the world or some aspect, something that you can be grateful for. You know, I'm grateful that there's oxygen right now, whatever it is, and start beginning with that.
I would
Mitch,
say,
Sabriya?
yeah, I would say that it's important to remember that your story, you're still writing your story. You're just on a chapter. Until you take your last breath, your story still continues. And so just be willing to get to the next chapter. Be willing to add a little to the page, because even if it's like a 2-page chapter, it doesn't matter. You still have another chapter to write, but your book does not have to end here.
I'm going to give the same advice I give you, Keith, because I give it to myself all the time. Thich Nhat Hanh calls breath home. And I believe that's true. It's amazing the studies that they show on the brain and the body, how it's impacted by just simply breathing deeply, and how the emotion and the spirit is impacted by deep breath. And so I'm going to say, first of all, just breathe. It can seem so overwhelming, whatever you're going through. And show up. Show up. We need you. So show up.
Thank you. Thank you, Mitch. Thank you, all of you. So let's go ahead and end the conversation. For those of you who've been watching and listening, of course, this is Dr. Keith McNally with Martin, Mitch, and Sabriya, and I will see you next time. Take care.